All right, what's going on, everyone? So I thought today we could talk about how the United States and the West in general can prepare for an attritional style war with a peer or near peer adversary. It's not a rosy subject, but it's the kind of conversation we have to have. People have to be thinking about this, taking the right lessons out of a war like what is happening in Ukraine, or we'll end up being caught flat-footed, and that's a problem. So the Royal United Services Institute just put together an article that I'll link in the description below that we're going to run through here, titled The Attritional Art of War, Lessons from the Russian War on Ukraine. And there's some really interesting points here, and it's worth the read. It's kind of a long read, but it's worth looking through if you're interested in this kind of thing. I'll hit on some of the high points and some of the areas that stood out to me specifically. They said if the West is serious about the possibility of a great power conflict, it needs to take a hard look at its capacity to wage a protracted war and to pursue a strategy focused on attrition rather than maneuver. Easier said than done. That is a major shift in U.S. military doctrine and Western military doctrine. We're not built for this. We don't want to fight this kind of war, and they kind of get into this. They say the West is not prepared for this kind of war. Wars of attrition are treated as exceptions, something to be avoided at all costs. As conflict drags on, the war is won by economies, not armies. States that grasp this and fight such a war via an attritional strategy aimed at exhausting enemy resources while preserving their own are more likely to win. So the last aspect there is kind of describing attritional style warfare, grinding down the enemy forces while building up your own, or at least maintaining your own to where you have the long-term advantage. They're spot on. He's spot on when he says that this is the type of thing that the United States and the West views as something to be avoided at all costs. That was the lesson learned from World War I. We saw what protracted trench warfare looked like, relative stalemate on the front, and just the meat grinder that war turned into. A lot of the innovations that came out of that war were trying to avoid that. There's nobody that looks at that style of warfare and says, you know what, that would be a good thing. That's where we want to get to. So one of the aspects of this article is kind of saying that that's where we're going to go. That's how a peer or near peer conflict will inevitably end up. I think that's up for debate, but either way, they're spot on in saying that it's not the type of war that the United States is prepared for. We don't want to fight that kind of war. It was awful on so many different levels. Now, hitting on the economic dimension here, they say wars of attrition are won by economies enabling mass mobilization of militaries via their industrial sectors. Because high-end weaponry is very complex to manufacture and consumes vast resources, a high-low mix of forces and weapons is imperative in order to win. This is a big conversation right now. The equipment that we produce in the U.S. military and Western militaries in general, honestly, you could say all around the world, is so complex, it takes a long time to churn these things out, and they're very, very expensive. But, what happens when we get into a war where volume matters? They have a great example here where they say, or where volume is the deciding factor, is maybe what I should say. They gave an example saying during the Second World War, German panzers were superb tanks, but using approximately the same production resources, the Soviets rolled out 8 T-34s for every German panzer. The difference in performance did not justify the numerical disparity in production. That's a very real thing. And I think right now, one of the lessons we can take from the ongoing war in Ukraine is there's this constant argument of quality versus quantity. And I would take a M777 U.S.-built howitzer over a D-20, D-30, anything of the Russian variety. I think it's a better weapon system all around. However, if Russia is able to churn out 10-1, that all of a sudden kind of overcomes the technical differences, doesn't it? And they use tanks in this example, but I think it applies across the board. I mean, all the way down to the individual rifles. How long does it take to churn out a rifle that your soldiers are going to carry? The type of ammunition being fired from howitzers, rockets, missiles, aircraft, everything. It's something to consider. What we build right now is very, very expensive, very, very high end. How would that fare in a attritional style war? They say during war, global supply chains are disrupted and subcomponents can no longer be secured. This is another lesson that I hope we're taking away from the ongoing war in Ukraine. We levied pretty significant sanctions on Russia, and they were able to rather quickly adapt and continue to fight this war. I mean, if you go back to the early days of the war, this is when everyone was saying Russia is going to run out of missiles, because a lot of the components that are in these precision guidance systems are Western produced. They're not going to be able to get these anymore. And sure enough, here we are at the end of March 2024, and just a couple days ago, Russia launched another massive missile barrage against Ukraine. They still have missiles. They've found workarounds, and it's kind of the case across their economy. A lot of the thoughts with the sanctions was that the Russian economy would collapse and there would be pressure from beneath to force Putin to stop this war because the people all across Russia were suffering. That hasn't happened. And it makes you wonder, what would a similar situation look like in the United States if we were hit with some kind of sanctions from other countries around the world, or maybe more appropriately, certain producers of various components around the world were no longer accessible to U.S. markets. What does that do? Are we ready for that? My gut says we're probably not, but of course, it's the kind of thing that has to be considered. Now, a lot of the focus in this piece is big picture. They do get into some tactical aspects that we'll touch on here in a minute, but there's also an individual aspect that I think is worth touching on. Historically, wars have led to pretty tumultuous economic times on the home front, which is one of the reasons that's often cited to consider adding physical gold to your portfolio through a company like American Hartford Gold. Look, I'm not a financial advisor, not by a long shot, and every situation is different, so keep that in mind. However, Investopedia, you can look this up, listed geopolitical uncertainty as one of the 8 key reasons for owning physical gold, as they say it's, quote, the crisis commodity, because people flee to its relative safety when world tensions rise. Now, those of you watching this video and consuming this type of content around war and geopolitics understand better than the vast majority of the population the tenuous situation that the world's in. Now, I genuinely do not believe that we're on the brink of World War III, but even smaller conflicts have historically caused pretty significant disruptions to our financial sector. You and I both know, unfortunately, that we could wake up any day and find out there's been some sort of escalation with China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda. Unfortunately, that list goes on and on. So with that in mind, it's never a bad time to at least have a conversation with an expert about adding a safe haven asset to your portfolio. Check out American Hartford Gold by using the link in the description. You can call 866-404-2258 or text Preston to 65532. Tell them I sent you and they'll give you up to $5,000 in free silver on your first order. They then get into force generation, which is arguably the most important aspect of all of this. How are you going to have enough manpower to fight a fight that is just producing massive amounts of casualties every single day? It was a major conversation during World War I. They talk about 2 major models and kind of compare and contrast the two. They have the NATO model, used by most Western militaries, and then the old Soviet model, which the Russian military in Ukraine has actually been kind of reverting to more and more as this war goes on. So at a high level, they say NATO armies are highly professional, backed by a strong non-commissioned officer corps, NCOs, with extensive peacetime military education and experience. They build upon this professionalism through their military doctrine to stress individual initiative, delegating a great deal of leeway to junior officers and NCOs. NATO formations enjoy tremendous agility and flexibility to exploit opportunities on a dynamic battlefield. I agree. Having spent a little bit of time in the U.S. military over the past few years, that's a major strength of our force, is the ability of junior leaders to be able to take the initiative and problem solve. The idea is kind of giving somebody the commander's intent. Here's generally what I want to see happen. Here's your left and right limits. And then you let the people on the ground execute that mission in the best way they see possible. That is a major advantage in a lot of ways that NATO-style militaries hold over, say, the old Soviet model. But they talk about in an attritional style war, this actually has a significant downfall. They say the U.S. Army NCO takes years to develop. A squad leader generally has at least 3 years in service, and a platoon sergeant has at least 7. In an attritional war characterized by heavy casualties, there simply isn't time to replace lost NCOs or generate them for new units. I disagree a little bit with this because in the middle of a major war, the amount of experience that a soldier gets is expedited. Right? If you go back through any major wars in history, you'll see these people. I just finished Masters of the Air the other night, right? Guys came in 43, it ended up over in Europe as lieutenants, and they left a few years later as lieutenant colonels. They picked up a lot of experience because they were fighting a war every single day. And there's no better way to learn than in that combat environment. So yes, in a peacetime military, it takes us years upon years to build up the professionalism of a sergeant or a sergeant first class to lead their squads, platoons. In a combat environment, you can expect that to be shortened. It's going to be a different product. You're going to have a warfighter versus a garrison type soldier, but I don't know that you can draw that hard line and say it's going to take 7 years in a combat environment to get that platoon sergeant up to expected standards. Then shifting over to the other side here, they say the Soviet Union built its army for large-scale conflict with NATO. It was intended to be able to rapidly expand by calling up massed reserves. They say the absence of reliable NCOs created an officer-centric command model, less flexible than NATO's, but more adaptable to the large-scale expansion required by attritional warfare. I don't really agree with that. It's hard to follow that logic entirely. And I want to try to be careful here and not thinking that the way we do something is the best way, end all be all. In this case, when you're talking about purely getting the most number of people together in a short period of time with some degree of military training, the Soviet Union and modern day Russia, through their mandatory military service, or the aspect that has some mandatory military service, means that they're able to pull together a lot more people very quickly. But those are kind of limited train. But there's still some value there, especially in an attritional style war. But this argument that because they don't have NCOs, they're more reliable on officers, that doesn't strike me as a benefit per se. It essentially, those responsibilities are delegated through the U.S. officer and NCO Corps are concentrated with the officers of the Soviet military. I don't know that that is helpful necessarily. It's kind of being presented here as a positive. I'm not sure that's the case. They do say the most effective model here is kind of a mix of these two versions, the NATO and the old Soviet model, in which a state maintains a medium-sized professional army together with a mass of draftees available for mobilization. This leads to a directly high-low mixture, they say, where professional pre-war forces from the high end of this army become kind of fire maneuver brigades, moving from sector to sector in a battle to stabilize the situation and conduct decisive attacks, low-end formations, then hold the line and gain experience slowly, increasing their quality until they gain the capability to conduct offensive operations. This is kind of the core of how they view, the author here views large-scale attritional war between two conventional adversaries, or two peer or near-peer adversaries, is that there's going to be this period of time where the two forces clash and the lines kind of have to be held before forces and equipment can be regenerated for some sort of offensive operation. So in that context, what he's presenting here is pull those professional soldiers off the line, right? Only use them for specific named operations, for high-value targets, significant objectives, things like that. Whereas the majority of the line can be held with guys, 3-4 months worth of training. It doesn't require nearly as much training to man a defensive position and pull the trigger or call up a report when enemy forces start to advance. Then in taking this whole assessment and applying it to modern war, using kind of what we've learned from Ukraine, they gave some interesting examples here. They talk about how a ground offensive requires a tight protective bubble to ward off enemy strike systems. They say this bubble is generated through layering friendly counterfire, air defense, and electronic warfare assets. Moving numerous independent systems is highly complicated and unlikely to be successful. Shallow attacks along the forward line of troops are most likely to be successful at an acceptable cost ratio. Attempts at deep penetration will be exposed to mass fires the minute they exit the protection of the defensive bubble. This is something we are seeing play out every single day in Ukraine and have since the opening of the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022. The minute that Russian forces at the opening of that invasion outran their cover, essentially, they got past their local air defenses, they started to come under fire from Ukrainian drones, mostly, but also some fixed and rotary wing assets. This is the challenge. When there's so many drones and loitering munitions and short-range rockets, missiles, anti-tank guided missiles, all of that stuff, you have to move forward at a very slow pace and keep those protection assets nearby. And that takes a long time. It's really hard to make that work. And they gave an example here saying all of these systems need to work as an integrated team just to support 30 men in several vehicles attacking another 30 men or less. A lack of coordination between these assets will result in failed attacks and horrific losses without ever seeing the enemy. I highlighted this because I thought it's interesting that this RUSI assessment of, large-scale attritional style war calls out 30 losses, 30 men being killed with their equipment as being horrific losses. That is an attack that Russia is carrying out multiple times every single day in Ukraine. I mean, day in and day out, we see attacks of 30 men or less that are all killed as they approach Ukrainian lines. So maybe another aspect they don't really hit on here that I think is important is that I don't know how willing the United States is, the population is, to sustain that type of loss over and over again. Maybe a conversation for a different day. But as I was reading this, something that came to mind was these very deliberate coordinations, right? It was hard enough in World War I, World War II. In World War I, it was hard enough to coordinate artillery, tanks, and infantry. That was a game changer when they figured that out. when those three forces could operate together towards a single objective. In World War II, we added, in some places, naval gunfire, especially in the Pacific. In the European theater, Africa and Italy, there was of course, also have to include the air forces. That coordination was a major step up. Being able to do that, being able to incorporate aircraft with the forces on the ground takes a lot of work. You don't just fall into that and hope it works out. Now, all of a sudden, we're layering in all of these jamming, electronic warfare, air defense assets, short-range drones. Like, it's hard to explain how challenging of a situation that is. Maybe, one thought, is that's the type of thing that our full-time military can be training for day in and day out, like they likely are. And then in the event of a large-scale war, those forces are able to conduct those types of operations because they have the training, the expertise, and they put the time into that sort of battlefield synchronization. They say in attritional war, any terrain that does not have a vital industrial center is irrelevant. It is always better to retreat and preserve forces, regardless of the political consequences. Fighting on disadvantageous terrain burns up units, losing experienced soldiers who are key to victory. This is something, again, if we can apply this to what we've seen play out in Ukraine, it's interesting to think about this, right? There's not really in the East or in the South right now any terrain that has a vital industrial center that's at the front. As Russian forces continue to advance, if they continue to advance, they're going to come into more contact with more and more of those. But it raises questions about places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka or Marinka. Those weren't necessarily in any way, shape, or form vital industrial centers when looking at the overall scope of the war, right? It's not like when Bakhmut fell, Ukraine lost the ability to produce artillery ammunition. And when Avdiivka fell, they could no longer produce drones, right? It wasn't that critical to the war effort, but they also were advantageous positions in that Ukraine had built up those defensive over years to where they were able to pretty effectively, for a while, deplete Russian forces and their strength as they pushed up against them. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there, if you will. There's a couple things to think about on that front. They say, unfortunately, many in the West have a very Cavalier attitude that the future of conflicts will be short and decisive. I think that's human nature. Just nobody wants to get into a situation or a war. I can't imagine anyone around the world that says, yes, let's start a war. I hope that it consumes the vast majority of our economy, borderline tanks our country, and we lose tens of millions of people. Nobody's hoping for that to happen. So I think that's just human nature. The goal of these wars is to be short, sweet, and decisive. They say the resulting war will become attritional and will favor the state which has the economy, doctrine, and military structure that is better suited towards this form of conflict. I would add in there, it'll favor the state that can be flexible when that is identified. When we find out that, in attritional style war, there's a couple ways to go about it. You can go into it intentionally and say, this is our goal. We're going to begin fighting adversary X, and we're going to try to do this in a means that just grinds down their forces over time and completely depletes their ability to wage war. Or you can get into it accidentally. You just kind of fall into it after months or years of trying the same thing, which is arguably what happened in World War I, at least in the early stages. I would add into this, it'll favor the state that can be most flexible in that adaptation. So whichever state can recognize where we are in the early stages of this attritional war, recognize that we're there and make the necessary changes to kind of turn to a full war economy and pull up the pipeline of additional soldiers and troops needed to fill these roles on the battlefield. And then in wrapping up, they say if the West is serious about a possible great power conflict, it needs to take a hard look at its industrial capacity, mobilization doctrine, and means of waging a protracted war, rather than conducting war games covering a single month of conflict and hoping that the war will end afterwards. I agree. It's, easier said than done. I think in some capacities, as we've watched the war play out in Ukraine, it has gotten some people's attention in the United States. I think the most notable one is the quantity of ammunition, seeing how long it takes for us to produce the amount that Ukraine needs to fight Russia, I think was an eye-opener for a lot of people. I've argued in the past, and I stand by it, that if we get into an artillery-focused war with Russia, that means we failed somewhere along the line. That's not the fight we want to fight. We're also not directly engaged in this conflict. So it's not as though the industry hasn't stood up and we're trying in every way, shape, or form to do it. We just can't do it. I don't know that the economy wants to move to a wartime economy because Russia is fighting Ukraine. Maybe that's different if the United States is involved. But or in a future conflict where the United States is involved. But again, it's all a conversation worth having, something to think about, looking at the industrial capacity, mobilization doctrine, and means of waging a protracted war. Again, in the unfortunate event, as the authors say here, that the next major peer or near peer conflict turns into an attritional style war. Again, I'll link this article in the description below if interested. It's kind of a long read, but I did not hit on everything here. So if interested at all in this, definitely check it out. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.